good afternoon to everyone who wanted to just join it. Welcome to today's webinar on practical approaches to benefit risk analysis of medical devices. Before we start, please note that we should have a couple of minutes for questions at the end. So if you have any, just write them down on a Q&A window, not the chat window, so we can see them, and I'll try to address them at the end. So before also we go into the slides, just a brief introduction about myself. My name is Tiago. I'm a regulatory affairs specialist at Svir's regulatory consultancy. I have a background in biomedical sciences. I first worked for a number of years in medical research, and then I moved into the medical device industry, first as a R&D engineer, and then later on as a regulatory affairs consultant. But enough about me. Let's move on to the topic of today. So we hope by the end of this webinar, you could all learn something new about individual and overall risk acceptability and how it can be determined, as well as how clinical benefits can be identified so it can be subsequently used in the benefit risk analysis of your medical devices. So why do we have to think about risk management in the first place? Well, risk management helps manufacturers identify potential hazards and evaluate the associated risks with their medical devices. In Europe, it's essential for compliance with MDR. If you look at Article 10.9, it clearly states that the quality management system addressing risk management is required. Then you can also find other requirements related to risk management in GSPRs 2 to 5, mainly. And then this is also mentioned in ISO 13485, the ISO for quality management systems, as it requires that risk management approach is applied across all the QMS processes. In practice, what it means that organizations must follow ISO 14971, the ISO for risk management medical devices, to develop and implement the risk management system that meets the regulatory requirements. So this ISO 14971, details all the elements that the risk management process must include. And that should be described also in the risk management plan of every device. But in a brief manner, it starts with the risk assessment. So you have risk analysis and risk evaluation. Then you have the risk control and the evaluation of the overall residual risk, topic that we are focusing on today. And then you have risk management review. And finally, you should also cover production and post-production activities. Plus, to be compliant with both MDR and ISO 14971, bear in mind that this process must span the entire life cycle of the device, from initial conception and design all the way to disposal. And to be honest, what we see sometimes is that manufacturers don't cover well the whole life cycle in the risk management, as they somewhat overlook one or more of these phases. So, for example, risk related to design and use might be fairly well covered in the risk analysis, but those related to shipping sometimes are not so much. So one of the first steps when you create a risk management plan is to determine the risk acceptability. What's risk acceptability? It's basically whether we consider a specific risk to be tolerable based on predefined criteria. This acceptability is usually described using this color-coded matrices as you see in the screen. So you have green for the acceptable region and red for the unacceptable one. Most often, manufacturers will use a 5x5 matrix. It's quite standard. But you can also consider a matrix that is 3x3 in case your device is quite a low-risk device, or if you're just assessing accessories of medical devices, for example. On the other side, if you have quite a high-risk device, quite complex ones, such as those using cardiovascular surgery, for example, you can actually go for a matrix that is, for example, 7x7 or some combination like 5x7, so you can better differentiate between the different severity levels. Then severity is usually described in a qualitative manner, while probability can also be described in a quantitative way. So you'd say once in 10,000 uses, for example. The important thing is that you should make sure that the quantitative estimates can be substantiated, especially with your clinical data. So it can be coming from your clinical investigations or your post-market data if it's available. So remember that this needs to be demonstrated at least for the more common occurring residual risks, which will also be addressed somehow in your instructions for use. As you might already know, severity is a measure of the possible consequences of an hazard, which will reflect the risk towards the patient and or the intended user. However, when you're covering the life cycle phases of production and shipping, it might also be good to use a scale in relation to the quality of the product. So usually you see this scale referred to as a criticality scale instead of a severity one. The acceptability for a specific medical device that needs to be determined in line with your risk management policy. Still, for your specific device, you may need to make some adjustments to the criteria. So, for example, imagine a case like this on the slide. There is no defined need that all the risks scored with a 4 or with a 6 need to be either green or red every time. The acceptability is dependent and should be aligned with your risk management policy. That's the important thing. Then the literature search as part of the clinical evaluation is the critical input to determine the acceptability criteria, meaning that you need to determine the generic knowledge, state of the art for your device. And of course, you should also consider applicable regulations and any specific concerns of the stakeholder as indicated in ISO 14791. It's important to remember a couple of points related to this point as well. So not only risks falling in the unacceptable lesion need to be lowered, but you should also try to lower risks falling in the acceptable region. So your device is compliant with GSPR2. Also, remember that acceptability does not mean that there is zero risk, otherwise we would not be here talking about assessing residual risk after all. When it comes to determining now the overall risk acceptability, remember that its method and criteria need to be based on the manufacturer's policy and also included in your risk management plan. The method we use the most is to create an overview of where the risks fall on the scale, as you see in this example, after the risk control, risk reduction controls. We would expect that most residual risks fall in the lower part of this scale, as you would have determined up front. An essential point also to keep in mind is that overall acceptability is not the same as individual acceptability. What I mean by this is that, for example, an individual risk might be acceptable, but the overall combination of all the risks might not be. So I'll give you an example. When there is clustering at the same region or at the border between regions, for example, as you see here, it might not be considered acceptable anymore. So are 4 risks with a severity of 2 and probability of 3 really acceptable? Maybe if you have just 1 falling in this category, you would consider acceptable. But when there are more risks falling in it, the situation might change. The subsequent step is to perform a benefit risk analysis when one assesses the benefit and the risk related to the use of the device. The purpose of this determination is to show that the benefits of the intended use always outweigh the residual risk. I think that the benefit is quite clear to everyone, but just remember that the benefit might not just be a positive impact on the health of the patient, but also on the patient management or benefit to public health, for example. And the risk is the combination of the probability of occurrence of harm and the severity of that harm, as some of you might already know. Regarding the analysis then, it can be done in 2 ways. So you can follow a more qualitative manner or a quantitative one. As sources of benefit data, we can use information from different sources. So, for example, clinical investigations or post-market surveillance or scientific literature. This is what we call usually real-world evidence. And then we describe the benefits. When we describe the benefits, we should address aspects such as this was on the screen. So the type of benefit, if it's the benefit for the patients or if the benefit is for the healthcare professionals. And you can also consider, for example, the level of medical necessity. So whether the device is intended for the treatment of an unmet clinical need. We see that qualitative approach is often accepted for most devices. To be honest, it's the easiest way. This is almost always described in a narrative way, as we see it in this example. Although parameters such as magnitude of benefit might be based on calculations as well, and I'll address that later in the presentation. Then you should address the risks by focusing on any unacceptable risks which cannot be lowered. Even if all the residual risks are deemed acceptable, you should include a description of the highest residual risks, which should be in line with the state of the art and included in some form then in your instructions for use. So going back to our example, you see that in this case, all the residual risks were acceptable. So we mentioned that first. Then we continue with the benefit risk analysis by briefly indicating where the residual risks fall on the scale. And then we focus on the highest ones, how these are controlled, and then we indicate that they are in line with the state of the art. Finally, we conclude that the risks are sufficiently mitigated and that the benefits outweigh the risks, meaning that it has a positive benefit-risk ratio. If we follow a more quantitative approach, basically we need to calculate the benefit-risk ratio, which needs to be equal or higher than 1. This ratio is no more than the benefit value divided by the risk value. The benefit value then is calculated by multiplying, as you see here, the frequency by the magnitude, and the risk value is equal to the frequency times the severity. Each clinical benefit will have a different magnitude, as we will use a similar scale as what is used for the severity. And usually we do this for all residual risks, which are then also emphasized in the IFU, just like what is done, what I showed before, that was done for the qualitative approach. So you have an example here of a magnitude scale. So it's quite easy to come up with it. So you just take your severity scale. So for example, for the magnitude 1, if when talking about severity, severity 1 was an inconvenience or an annoyance, then the benefit, of course, is the prevention of that inconvenience or annoyance. On the other extreme, if the severity was that using a device would lead to patient death, then the benefit is that it's life-saving, of course. So ideally, frequencies are based on your clinical data, meaning clinical investigation data, and if you have available post-market clinical follow-up and post-market surveillance data. However, for the risks, it is basically considered it's basically a copy-paste of the scoring from the risk analysis. So it's also aligned with their probability. Then, ideally, you're also going to do the calculations when compared to the state of the art, whereby you use the information which you detected in your state of the art. So if you go back to the same example device, but now expressing it in a more quantitative approach, you just list all your benefits. In this case, it was a simple device, it only had one main benefit. So again, you multiply the magnitude by the frequency to get the value for the benefit. You do the same for all your risks. You do the sum of that, and then you just divide it. In this case, we got 7.25, so there's a clear benefit, positive benefit risk ratio. Finally, then, we come to the update of the risk acceptability and the respective benefit risk analysis. The acceptability criteria might have to be changed due to a change in the guidelines and updating the guidelines or some other reason. So you should then re-verify that the benefits still outweigh the risks. It's a continuous ongoing process. For example, medical devices use, and then the clinicians find new ways to use the medical device or define additional types of benefit. Also, your PMS data might show that the risk in the end is higher than what you have anticipated or that you're not even thought of, to be honest. You can update this by using literature searches when preparing, for example, your search. And this way you may be able to support your benefit claims with real-world data. You do this in an identical way as for the clinical evaluation. So use the usual databases like PubMed, Cochrane, etc. Then after appraising the study quality and the relevance of the included articles, you update the risk assessment with the new findings. And then this way you can strengthen your benefit justifications and update your SARs and PSARs. The important thing to remember is that this all feeds into the post-market surveillance and ongoing risk management updates. As a final message, I'd like you to be aware of the main pitfalls we see, so you can also avoid these. So the two main ones is that, for example, manufacturers have a risk management policy that often lacks the clear criteria for acceptability and/or the criteria for the overall residual risk and the respective determination methods. The other pitfall we usually see is that some manufacturers make the mistake of performing a benefit risk analysis only when there are unacceptable risks. And you should do it in any case, of course. And as a final remark, remember that having a positive benefit ratio is essential to be compliant so you can have a safe and performing medical device on the market. So always take into account the generally acknowledged state of the art, which may then be updated over time. And that as a result, your risk management is always ongoing. This brings me to the end of my presentation. I see, we still have some time for questions. If not, you can also contact me afterwards via the email on the screen and we'll get back to you. So.
Well, thanks, Thiago. My name is actually Tom Maanders. I'm also working for Swedish Consultancy and also involved in a medical device, so hence my presence. And I think Aline is also one of our medical device experts, so she is here too as a sort of panelist. Thiago, thank you for a nice presentation. We have got some questions already prior to your session, but also during the session. So I will just ask you a few questions coming from those sources. Okay. So the first one is a quantitative approach for a risk benefit regarded more convincing? And how do you choose to go for qualitative or quantitative?
Well, to be honest, we have been successful in many situations with different notified bodies, as well as the FDA, just with a qualitative approach for the benefit risk analysis. And like I said, it's the easiest way, as you don't need really to perform any calculations. Of course, if you have a high-risk class device, then besides, like I said, using a matrix with more levels of distinction, of severity, then you probably need to use a more quantitative approach. That's when you decide for that.
Right. So one of your key factors is then the risk. Is it a high-risk device or no?
Yeah, exactly.
And in addition, I think to this, it might also be just a preference from the company, of course, to use maybe a quantitative approach. So yeah, obviously it is well possible. So it can be done with every single medical device. However, you also make it yourself, maybe, as Thiago already was stating, maybe more complicated than actually needed.
Yeah, if you're not yet in the market, I would expect that maybe you lack some data, some numbers to adequately support those calculations. But if you have already, if you're talking about a device that has been on the market for quite some time, you should have some data that you can use.
There are more questions popping in, Thiago. One of them is the margin of safety equal to or more than 1 is considered based on benefit risk ratio?
Margin of safety, use it in a different concept. Usually address it if you're looking at extractables and leachables, for example. So it's something more related to the biological evaluation.
Yes. So they're not connected in that sense.
Yeah. I don't know if Eileen would like to say.
No, that's fully correct indeed. So the margin of safety is really coupled to the biocompatibility, which is really a different concept. So here we're focusing on the benefit risk ratio, whereby still we are using the same kind of scoring that we want to have, of course, more benefits, or that the benefits outweigh the risk, and therefore your score should be at least hopefully higher than 1. So
okay. Well, that's clear. That's clear. What do you need as input to determine the risk acceptability criteria for a device, Thiago?
So first of all, risk management policy, which then will be based, like it's indicated in the ISO 14971, on things like applicable regulations, standards, the generally acknowledged state of the art, like I said, and also if there are any known stakeholder concerns. So the one thing I'd say that's very relevant is that because you need to perform the determine the state of the art, is essential that you do this literature search that is required for the clinical evaluation to use it as an input then. So even if you haven't done really of course, you haven't done the full all the other steps of the clinical evaluation, literature search is essential for this.
I see, because there's also one question related to this, Thiago, and I think you already partly gave the answer to it. The question is, which comes first, the risk management files or the CER? So the CER refers to the risk management files to determine overall benefit risk analysis, but it seems like the risk management files also rely on the CER. Do they refer to the previous version of the CER? So it's all related, what you just explained.
Yeah. Well, I would say the risk management is one of the first things the clinical evaluation report needs to be included with your technical documentation. And I would say this comes afterwards. Usually you would have a risk management report that is, I would say, completed more or less at the same time as the clinical evaluation report. Don't know if maybe it's more clear for Lina. Don't know if that's answering the question. That's what they were asking.
Well, if you really start with a new device, then obviously you will first start up your risk management. And then later on, your clinical evaluation will follow. But in the end, the information which will be in the clinical evaluation presented will be fed into your risk management file. So therefore, yeah, you can talk about which files comes first, but in the end of the day, it will all run in parallel because they are all connected to each other. Which makes it quite complicated to say, okay, this one first, then that one. There are indeed, as Thiago said, there are some parts which are essential also to make a good risk management. So the state of the art needs to be there, and whether that's part of your, if that's part of your clinical evaluation report, then maybe you may need to execute that already.
Right. So use it with common sense, and well, parallel can be possible, but use it with common sense. I think that's what I'm hearing you both say. And I think this will be the last question. Can you explain more about the risk management policy and who should be involved in preparing this policy?
It's quite clearly defined in the ISO for 971 as well. The top management should define and document the policy. The policy, besides the risk acceptability, contains other elements like the purpose, the scope, also, like I said, determine the acceptability, how you determine it, how you, let me just think, how do you approach risk control and the requirements for approval and review. Yeah, those are the main things that it covers.
Right.
Yeah, and I think in this situation, it might also be definitely helpful not only to look at the ISO standard, but also at the related ISO technical report, the 24971, which also gives an example or more explanation about the risk management policy as well.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you both, Thiago, for, of course, your presentation, and you both for answering these questions. I think we are close to the end. Perhaps there's room for one more, Thiago?
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. I'm just reading it. I hope I understand it. The question is, if there is a failure of test, for instance, local toxicity, since it's a faulty test, so test looking for failure, how to support in that case, considering you can't do the test again? For example, cytotoxicity test. I'm not sure if that's related to risk management, what you just presented, but could you please, a few comments on it?
It will be somehow related as well to the risk analysis, but you would address it more on the biological evaluation report. We've had a few situations. You can try to write rationales and explain why, even though you had a negative result, it's quite common indeed for a cytotoxicity, why this result doesn't really translate to the in vivo situation. And you would have this in the biological evaluation report. Yes. And usually you would have then sensitization, irritation data, possibly based on in vivo results, but you didn't see anything where you had more positive results, let's say, and you can possibly also use it to support a bit your rationale.
Yes, it's not directly related to the risk management as such, but I think, thank you for answering that.
But I think also in addition to that, it may has to do whether you test your cytotoxicity direct or indirect. So it might be that you have a false, let's say, negative result. So it became cytotoxic, but maybe you ran the test with direct contact. Well, it would be more appropriate to have it with indirect contact. So it might also be good to look at those aspects as well. And then obviously, if you run not the correct test, then you can do a retest of it. So
Yes, I understand, Elena. I understand. Thanks for this explanation. And I think this brings us to the end of this webinar. I think the recordings will be made available to the participants, right? And with regards to the slides, Thiago and Aline, will they be made available, or is that not the case in this situation?
I think we can make the slides available too in PDF.
Yeah,
PDF.
so those are available then to the participants. This is also one of the questions. So again, I'd like to thank you, Thiago, and also Aline. And I like to thank also the participants. And well, don't hesitate to contact us if you have questions or you would like to have a follow-up with us.
Yeah, if there's any questions that you can come to your mind in the next few days, just contact us via email. And thanks for attending.